rights in the mid-1800s were very different than how they are now. Today, we're going to be covering a wide range of topics about how different types of people were treated back then.
First, we're going to be covering the legal system and how the different races of people were associated with it.
Before the 1800s, Canada didn't have their own legal system and was mostly controlled by Britain. But when the 1800s rolled around, Canadian legislators were established for the first time.
After the legal system was developed, people living in the country of Canada were treated as Canadians and not as citizens of their country of origin.
This legal system brought order to Canada, but also brought much conflict.
People did not always agree on the rules enforced by the legal system.
In 1858, Chinese immigrants migrated to British Columbia.
This caused conflict between men and women and the different races of people living in Canada at this time.
Between the years of 1867 and 1884, the Canadian Confederation was going on. In 1867, the British North America Act was passed, and on July 1st, Britain's North American colonies are united to become the Dominion of Canada.
In order to be an elector, you had to be a British male of age 21. However, this was very conflicting and was changed later on.
Women were absolutely not allowed to have anything to do with the government.
But we will talk about that later on.
The Chinese Immigration Act received royal assent and became law in 1885. This act placed a head tax of $50 on each Chinese immigrant.
$50 was a lot of money back then.
This was the first of many brutal laws to discriminate against the Chinese community.
In the 1800s, there was a lot of slavery in the United States. However, in Canada, there was a large anti-slavery society.
So in the mid-1800s, more and more African Americans were escaping to Canada.
They started receiving grants of land from the government so they could settle and make a living.
In 1866, Canada had its first black politician, Mifflin Gibbs, who was elected for the Victoria Town Council.
Let's not forget about the French. There were many French citizens living in Canada at the time.
Yes, they were all in Canada East, now known as Quebec. However, in the mid-1800s, a large portion of the population realized that it was getting harder to farm and make money.
So they immigrated to Canada West. When the Confederation happened, some French Canadians were not happy about it.
However, in 1867, all of Canada's provinces were united by one federal government.
Like a big happy family.
Sure. Anyways, there were also First Nations people living in Canada.
The government gave the Indians land reserves where they spent their entire lives.
At the time of the Confederation, First Nations were allowed to vote, but in order to do so, they had to give up their treaty rights and Indian status. This was changed later, and then changed back.
They weren't actually really allowed to vote until the late 20th century.
In the late 19th century, hunters were killing off the bison, whom the Aboriginal people depended on for food and clothing.
They had no choice but to sign several treaties to preserve their way of life. The following section of human rights that we will be talking to you about is racial standards.
In this subsection, we have multiple subsections. The first one is native rights.
Up until 1871, the natives lived under their own rule and kept their distance from the immigrants coming to their land.
Then, in 1871, treaties were signed amongst the Europeans and the natives. These treaties allowed the Europeans to control the natives, their land, and their rights.
The treaties state that there was to be no violence between the groups, but also that the natives had to give away most of their land.
They were left with only 600 square meters of land per family of 5.
This may seem like a lot of land, but they used the land for fishing, hunting, farming, and living.
As well as being allowed the land, the Aboriginals were offered a little bit of money and schooling for the young ones to learn the language and ways of the Europeans.
The Aboriginals seemed rather willing to sign these treaties, but only because they needed protected land to hunt on, and extra money in case they were short on food, as their natural food source was disappearing.
These treaties also meant that Aboriginals were treated as citizens of Canada.
Proof of this is the establishment of the Dominion Franchise Act in 1885. It stated that an eligible voter was any male person, including those of Aboriginal descent, but excluding those of Asian descent.
This brings us to our next subsection, Asian rights.
Asian peoples began to migrate to Canada around the time of the Fraser Gold Rush in 1858.
Originally, they began to migrate north from California, then immigrants began coming from overseas directly.
Their mining techniques were much more efficient than those of the Europeans and natives.
At the end of the gold rush, these people did not know what to do in Canada. They were not citizens and had no work.
Then, in 1871, British Columbia joined Confederation. One of the requirements for joining, however, was that they build a railway that would link BC to the rest of Canada.
The Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, decided to cut costs of labor by employing Chinese workers.
These workers were sent as guest workers and were not meant to settle in Canada or become citizens.
Many workers left the railways to go out to the various gold fields.
You cannot blame them for leaving, though. They were making less than $1 a day. Native, white, and black workers made 3 times as much.
After the Canadian Pacific Railway was complete, the Asian workers had no work. They were not seen as equal in Canada, and the government did not want any more of them.
The Chinese Immigration Act stated that any Chinese who wanted to come to Canada had to pay a head tax of $50. This did not deter them, so the head tax was raised.
Our final subsection is black rights.
There is not much to say for black rights.
The rights of blacks during this period of time were very similar to those of whites and Europeans.
At this point in time, slavery was almost non-existent in Canada. The country was a safe haven for black slaves escaping through the Underground Railway.
They were treated as equals in most parts of Canada and had the same voting rights as whites.
This is some of the information on different cultural rights between 1850 to 1890.
Next, we will be talking about LGBTQ rights. Although it had nothing to do with sodomy, same-sex activity was counted as sodomy back in that time period.
Sodomy is any form of sexual activity between a man and a non-man.
Back in this time period, sodomy charges were punishable by death.
There were no records of any women having same-sex activities. They had enough on their plates as it was with men in their life. There was no need for them to add to that.
But that will be discussed in the next portion of this report.
To show an example, in 1842, the first 2 historically recorded men that were criminally convicted of sodomy were named Patrick Kelly and Samuel Moore. The court records clearly describe as a consensual sexual activity.
2 men were sentenced to death in the Kingston Penitentiary. However, the sentences were commuted on August 22nd. Samuel was released from prison in 1849, although Patrick was only released from prison in 1853.
It is not particularly known why these men were released, but there are no surviving records to explain.
Back in the times of British North America, if men were caught in the act of same-sex activities, it would be punishable by death.
Even though it was recorded that many men were sentenced to death, there are no surviving record of men actually being executed.
The reason that men were being let go from their charges were because of political leaders stepping up and letting them go.
However, the penalty of death was soon repealed, although an even harder act was put into place.
This was about the hardest thing men had to face when talking about the legal system.
The final thing that we will be talking about is women's rights.
In this section, we are going to speak about just what rights women had and when they were introduced.
During this period of time, women were not considered equal to men.
They did not have the same rights and privileges as men and were treated poorly.
Before the 1800s, women had no rights at all in Canada. In fact, it was as if they didn't exist. Actually, before the 1800s, the country itself barely existed.
Starting in the year 1850, women had the right to vote for school trustees, but only if they owned property.
By 1859, women had the right to own property. However, they were still unable to sell their property. Selling the property required her husband's consent.
All of her inheritance went to the man and he owned it, so she could not do what she wanted with it. Women were practically owned by their husbands. If she tried to leave him, she would be caught and punished.
If a woman had decided to stay single, she would be ostracized and singled out by society.
A single woman had far less rights than a woman who was married.
In 1867, Dr. Emily Stowe graduated from New York State University in the field of medicine. Despite the fact that she had her degree, she was unable to legally practice as a physician until 1880 in Canada.
The Manitoba Act respecting married women was put into place. This act gave married women the right to fully control the money they made without their husband's consent.
Women received less than 60% as much as men in 1860.
The incomes of women who had no one to depend on were shocking.
The next year, the Married Women's Property Act of Ontario was enacted.
In 1876, a British common law stated that women are persons in matters of pain and penalties, but not persons in matters of rights and privileges.
In the late 1800s, the Toronto Women's Suffrage Association was created. This association was founded by Dr. Emily Stout.
In the year 1882, there was a major strike of female workers in Toronto. They wanted equal pay as men. Their methods worked because that year the Toronto Labour Council began to support the concept of equal pay for equal work.
In 1887, women in Manitoba gained the right to vote in municipal elections. They are not eligible for municipal office until 1917.
This was the beginning of women's rights movements in Canada.
We have come a long way, but let's be honest.
The male gender does still dominate. To this day, men receive higher wages than women.
So we still have a long way to go to make gender equality a reality.